I just unmuted myself, so there you go. We're going to start our webinar. Can everyone hear me now? Excellent. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us for this important conversation. My name is Siham Rayal, and I am one of the WCAPS Canada coordinators, as well as a senior policy analyst at Global Affairs Canada. I want to start by acknowledging the land that I'm standing on today. It is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'd like to note that we have interpretation available in French, Spanish, and International Sign Language. You can switch to your language of preference by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Against the specter of the conflict in Palestine and Israel, our conversation today takes on new meaning. With the bombing of Al Ahli Arab Hospital in Gaza, we're witnessing once again the devastation of war and the need for a peace that is indivisible from justice. The human cost, once again, and the devastation of war, and the need for peace that is indivisible from justice means that the WPS agenda must be more people-centered. It must encompass a justice that prevents the worst atrocities from happening in the first place. On October 25th of this year, the Security Council is scheduled to hold its annual open debate on women, peace, and security. It'll be titled Women's Participation in International Peace and Security, from Theory to Practice. Historically, leadership among Global South countries, including Mexico, Kenya, Nigeria, and India, on the women, peace, security agenda has been fundamental to the progression of gender equality worldwide. From the first conference of the UN Decade for Women, held in Mexico in 1975, through to the debates of the 1985 Third World Conference on Women in Nairobi, right up until the declaration that women played an essential part in creating sustainable peace at the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, activism on the issue has largely been led by women in the Global South. By the time that Resolution 1325 was being negotiated in 2000, the Global South was emboldened. It was Namibia, then president of the Security Council, which led the way, working with civil society actors across the Global South and North, which led to the Security Council and eventually to the passing of Resolution 1325. There has also been a surge of critical voices as of late on the erasure of women of color's voices on the WPS agenda since the inception of Resolution 1325, as though our contributions ended there, as though we are not continuing to call for the WPS agenda to reach its emancipatory potential. Our conversation today is to highlight the dialogue that began in 1975 and that continues today. And we are fortunate to have Ambassador Jackie O'Neill, who is Canada's first ambassador for women, peace, and security, to do our opening remarks. Appointed by the Prime Minister in 2019, she advises the Government of Canada on strengthening its global leadership on women, peace, and security, and the effective implementation of the National Action Plan on WPS. Throughout her career, Ambassador O'Neill has supported the creation and implementation of national strategies and policy frameworks for more than 40 countries, NATO, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the United Nations. She helped establish the field of women, peace, and security, and its application in governments, security forces, and multilateral organizations. As president of the Institute for Inclusive Security, Ambassador O'Neill directly supported coalitions of women leaders in Colombia, South Sudan, Pakistan, South Sudan, Sudan, Pakistan, and beyond. Ambassador O'Neill worked at the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Sudan and at Khartoum's Ahfad University for Women. Along with former Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, she helped found the Romeo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative to eliminate the use of children during conflict. Prior to that, Ambassador O'Neill was a policy advisor to Canada's Secretary of State for the Asia-Pacific region. I want to invite Ambassador O'Neill to open the conversation for us today and give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Siham. You said I'd be giving the opening today, but you just gave the best opening we could possibly have, the remarks that you just shared and the way you framed us. So I'm going to be very quick in reinforcing all that you just said. I'm here in Ottawa. Greetings to everyone from Ottawa, Canada. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people, who, as Siham mentioned, their presence here dates back to time immemorial. I really appreciate WCAPS Canada and GNWP for convening this conversation today. It's an essential conversation. I'm a big fan of both the organizations. I've known GNWP's work for, I don't know, at least more than 15 years. It's always grounded, practical, relevant. So much so we're delighted to have Panthea Pourmilloc working with us now. We promise not to try to steal everyone, but we're delighted to be able to have GNWP even closer to our office. And WCAPS, I was in Washington, D.C., I dare say a friend of Bonnie Jenkins when she founded the organization, and have just been amazed and delighted to see its growth. And I'll never forget, about 5 years ago or so, I was teaching a course at Georgetown University on women, peace, and security, graduate students. And I, of course, urged many members of the class or everyone to join WCAPS. And I remember at the end of the semester, a young African-American master's student came up to me kind of quietly at the end of the class. And she said, as we were reflecting on the semester and how it had been, and she said she had joined the US part of chapter of WCAPS and said, I never really felt like there was a place for me to work on WPS until I joined that group. And that was such a testament of how needed the organization is. And it was also just heartbreaking to know that I was part of a community that made her feel that way. Exactly as you mentioned, Siham, especially because this is an agenda, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, that emerged from women of color around the world. And people often ask us what Women, Peace, and Security is. What's the agenda? How do you define it? And I never go first to the Security Council resolutions or only to them, because we all know that literally for thousands of years, women have played key roles when it comes to war and peace. And that just struck me, especially, Siham, as you mentioned, the theme of the open debate about from theory to practice. And I think what happened is it's gone from practice to theory. Hopefully elements of practice as well, but it didn't start at theory. And we need, in Canada, not look any further than the communities on whose lands we now live and call Canada, to learn about ways that Indigenous women have long traditions of mediating between warring groups, for example. There are similar examples from every corner of the world. And as you mentioned, women have been mobilizing. They've been mobilizing for peace and regional and international networks even for over a century. It didn't start at the Security Council and it won't end at them. And it's evolving all the time. We now are addressing climate justice, climate impacts on security, cyber and tech facilitated gender-based violence. The challenges are multiplying. And we also know that resistance and opposition to this around the world is growing. And one of the most insane things that opponents assert is that this is a Western agenda and that it's being imposed on others, particularly the global South. And that just simply couldn't be further from the truth, because it has emerged from women in conflict areas in every part of the world. So it's events like this that sustain our collective memory of truth, that include and help us learn and remember this between generations, across regions, with current and with future leaders. And as you mentioned, Siham, it's an especially raw and awful and dangerous and scary time right now. And I know it's especially so for many of you both speaking and listening, and perhaps just speaking for myself, but I'm fairly certain for many others, there are a lot of moments in the last week, 2 weeks, where it feels like humanity is lost, our systems are broken, and it's so hard to find hope. And like so much work that so many people are doing every day to try to build peace is being lost more and more each day. And so I'm just especially grateful to be able to listen to this conversation and to be with community today. I think this is among the times we need solidarity the most, and we need to listen and hear from each other, and especially the very wonderful speakers you have set up to talk to us today. So I'm going to end there and just say thank you so much for convening this conversation and for giving us this space. All the best.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your heartfelt words. So our conversation today will be a moderated discussion. And what that means is that we have convened some phenomenal women, activists and scholars. If I can introduce them, I'd like to emphasize that each of them are powerhouses in their own right, but that are also going to be speaking on women, peace, and security, and all that means from Lebanon to the Philippines to the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and to Colombia. Professor Marie-Joëlle Zahar, Political Science Director of the Research Network on Peace Operations and Fellow at the Center for International Research and Studies at the University de Montréal. Dr. Jasmine Nario Galas, Senior Program Director at the Global Network for Women Peace Builders, of Women Peace Builders. Ms. Annie Matundu Mbambi, Program Advisor for DRC at the Global Network of Women Peace Builders and President of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF Africa. Ms. Zulma Armado, member of Red Departamental de Mujeres del Cauca, REDEMUC, member of the Local Steering Committee on UNSCR 1325 in Cauca, Colombia, leader and human rights defender. Thank you, all of you, for joining us in this pivotal conversation today. If I can pose the first question to Professor Zahar, and then followed by Dr. Nario Galas, followed by Ms. Mbambi, and then Ms. Armado, I'd like to ask, in your view, what are the greatest contributions of women of color to the advancement of peace and security and the Women, Peace and Security agenda in both your local context, but also globally? From your perspective, whose voices have been historically excluded? Professor Zahar, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you so very much for the invitation to join. I'm speaking today from Beirut and the Middle East, and so as Ambassador O'Neill said, this takes special significance. And this is also why I want to talk about the contributions of women in the context of the Middle East, not the broad context. I'll leave that to my colleagues. I will start with women peace builders. Even before there was a WPS agenda, women have been the most courageous in taking the first step towards building peace, including in the context of Israel-Palestine. And as Ambassador O'Neill so cogently said, seeing their efforts, their courage, the sacrifices they've made actually to bring about peace and security unravel before our eyes is particularly difficult. I would also say that in the Middle East context, women have been important contributors to bringing us to focus away from security responses to things such as radicalization, and in the design and implementation of preventative approaches to address youth radicalization in the region. They've made us focus below the national level, not just at national action plans, but also at daily grind work which actually might not be very visible, but actually brings results. I would also add women in the Middle East have been, I'd say, pioneers in approaching exclusion, including their own, from an intersectional perspective. In Lebanon, for example, where I'm currently speaking from, they've actually collaborated with refugees, with LGBTQ plus communities, with foreign domestic workers, in bringing about an intersectional approach to issues of peace and security. And they've often done that at great risk to themselves. Now, who isn't excluded? Those same women who've been pioneers in so many important ways for our WPS agenda are excluded, continue to be excluded by their governments, and as I will discuss maybe later, in international fora. They're not given their due. They're not acknowledged for what they've done on the ground. And in fact, sadly, sometimes our high-level politics undermine the work that they do on a daily basis to try and improve the conditions in their communities, in their countries, in the region. And I would say, that of course happens also in other regions as well. But let me stop here and leave it to other colleagues to maybe bring their own additional perspectives on the matter.
Dr. Nario Galas.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I feel very honored to be with you all today. What are the greatest contributions of women of color to the advancement of peace and security? Surely women of color have contributed immensely to the advancement of peace and security. And I will speak close to our experience at the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, GNWP, which comprises a diverse international team, predominantly consisting of women of color, has played a pivotal role in the development of national action plans on women, peace, and security in 25 countries. With no intention of boasting about our experience, GNWP has played a significant role in facilitating the creation of local action plans in grassroots communities directly affected by conflict. These plans aim to either strengthen the implementation of the NAP or, when none exists, to initiate the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Through the years, we have been enhancing capacities of women, youth, local officials, religious leaders, academicians, grassroots organizations, women's organizations on conflict prevention and resolution and peace building, where women's leadership is not only important, but an imperative if we want peace that is just and sustainable. In Jiwaka and other regions in Papua New Guinea, where GNPW works, I have had the privilege of meeting courageous women of color who play vital roles in establishing and sustaining peace at the community level, even amidst extreme challenges, such as intense tribal conflicts, the proliferation of weapons, political violence, and potential sorcery accusations that often lead to brutal consequences. These exceptional women engage in grassroots organizing, conflict prevention, resolution, and reconciliation efforts, drawing upon their cultural knowledge, unique perspectives, and lived experiences. In the Philippines, my home country, those considered women of color, whose voices have been historically excluded, the Muslim and indigenous women, have been staunch advocates for vulnerable populations, internally displaced individuals, and victims of violence, including clan conflicts, or RIDO in our local language. Their work extends to addressing the specific needs of these groups in conflict and post-conflict scenarios. Their contributions have shed light on the unique challenges faced by marginalized women on multiple fronts, contributing to the formulation of more comprehensive and effective peace and security strategies. Women of color indeed have made invaluable contributions to the advancement of peace and security, often at significant personal risk. Their voices have long been marginalized, but global efforts to implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda are gradually recognizing the importance of their participation and experiences in shaping a more inclusive and effective approach to peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nariogalas. Can I ask Miss Annie to turn on her camera? I know that she's with us. Okay. So we will wait for Miss Annie to turn on her camera. In the meantime, can I invite Ms. Hurtado to offer her remarks?
Muy buenos días para todas, muy orgullosa desde Colombia poder compartir con ustedes todo el trabajo como Red Departamental de Mujeres del Cauca. Venimos trabajando en la resolución 1325. Nosotras desde el 2020 venimos conectadas con la paz, que es el lema de nosotras. Bueno, las contribuciones de las mujeres negras al avance de la paz y la seguridad han sido muchos. Nosotras como mujeres negras a lo largo de la historia, hemos desempeñado roles claves en la lucha por la justicia social, por la igualdad, por la paz, ¿sí? En nuestras comunidades y en todo el mundo. Se han liderado movimientos civiles, ¿sí? Abogando por el fin de la violencia y la opresión, ¿sí? Hemos promovido reconciliación y armonía en los territorios. Tenemos algunas mujeres negras destacadas a lo largo de la historia, ¿sí? Como ella, Rosa Parks, quien se negó a ceder su asiento en el autobús segregado, desencadenando el movimiento de los derechos civiles en Estados Unidos. Entonces, esos son actos de paz. También tenemos a Wari Matai, una activista medioambiental y ganadora del Premio Nobel de Paz, que fundó un movimiento Cinturón Verde en Kenia para promover la paz y la sostenibilidad a través de la plantación de árboles. Aquí en Colombia tenemos a nuestra vicepresidencia, Francia Elena Márquez Mina, ¿sí? Ella es una lideresa social, defensora de derechos humanos y del medio ambiente. Además, las mujeres negras hemos desempeñado un papel fundamental en la construcción de puentes entre nuestras comunidades divididas y en la promoción de un diálogo y una reconciliación. Reconciliación entre puentes para promocionar el diálogo y la reconciliación en nuestros territorios. Hacemos un activismo que ha sido fundamental para abordar las desigualdades que hay en los territorios, para enfrentar el conflicto y luchar por una paz sostenible y duradera. Las mujeres negras hemos realizado valiosas contribuciones a lo largo de la historia, con nuestro activismo, nuestro liderazgo en defensa siempre de la vida, del diálogo, de la reconciliación, siempre perseverando, inspirando y a otras generaciones futuras en la búsqueda de un mundo más pacífico. También tenemos voces de mujeres que históricamente han sido excluidas en la sociedad debido a la discriminación racial y al género. Esto nos ha llevado a una marginación en la toma de decisiones que es muy importante para nosotras. Esa desde la Red Departamental de Mujeres les puedo hacer ese pequeño aporte.
Gracias, Ms. Hurtado. Chère Annie, c'est à vous. Pouvez-vous, s'il vous plaît, nous partager votre intervention? Oh, d'accord, Annie. Yeah. Annie?
Allô?
Oh, allô?
Oui, je vous écoute. Allô?
Ah, there you are. Okay.
Je vous écoute.
D'accord.
Allô?
On vous entend.
Ah, ok. Je voudrais d'abord parler, je m'excuse pour le retard, la connexion a été très difficile pour se connecter. Mais j'aimerais parler des contributions des femmes racialisées à l'avancement de la paix et la sécurité, à l'agenda Femmes, Paix, Sécurité dans le contexte de la RDC. Comme vous le savez, la résolution 1325 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies a eu son importance dans la prévention des conflits, la participation à la consolidation de la paix, la protection des droits des femmes et des filles pendant et après les conflits, ainsi que les besoins spécifiques lors du rapatriement et de la réinstallation, et pendant la période de relèvement et de réintégration. Comme vous savez, cette résolution pour nous qui sommes en conflit, nous les prenons d'après les 4 piliers qui se trouvent dans l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité. En tant que femmes racialisées, nous avons apporté des contributions significatives à l'avancement de la paix et de la sécurité. Comme vous le savez, il y a un rapport du département des opérations de paix des Nations Unies qui ont montré le rôle important que les femmes ont joué dans la prévention et la consolidation de la paix, ainsi que dans les transitions politiques. Pour le moment, en RDC, nous sommes dans une période électorale et les femmes continuent à faire des plaidoyers pour que ces élections se passent dans la transparence et dans l'apaisement. En continuant à jouer ce rôle, les femmes et les jeunes qui sont engagés dans les 4 piliers de la résolution 1325, sans oublier la participation, la protection et la prévention, les processus de consolidation de paix ont eu un impact qui est très appréciable d'après le travail que les femmes sont en train de faire sur le terrain. En RDC, nous avons eu à monitorer les indicateurs de la résolution 1325 pendant 4 ans avec l'aide technique et financière de GNWP pour voir son évolution. Et là, nous pouvons dire s'il y a progression ou ralentissement des efforts que nous avons eu à fournir. Donc, nous comprenons que ces contributions sont très importantes pour assurer une paix durable dans le monde en général, et en particulier en RDC, où nous continuons à vivre dans le conflit et avec la guerre qui se passe à l'Est. Donc, le rôle que les femmes continuent à jouer, on espère, pourra apaiser l'insécurité et les guerres qui continuent à vivre la RDC. Je me limite d'abord sur cette question. Merci.
Merci, Yanni. To hear about all of these different contexts and the work that many of you have been doing for so long, I know as a young feminist, I've heard of the stories and contributions of women of color from the 1980s and the 1990s and their activism, which led to the creation of the WPS agenda. And many of you have already highlighted that. We know you've been active in the field for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit more about your networks and your networks' contribution to the establishment of the WPS agenda? Can I ask Professor Zahar to start?
So mine will be a relatively quick answer and an honest one, because I can't claim activism in the field before 1325. I came to WPS relatively late. my initial interest was in non-state armed actors, and it's by going to the field and talking to people, trying to understand civilians' relations with armed groups, that I came to actually realize the importance of women and start getting interested in and engaged with the WPS agenda. However, I will say that women in the broader Middle East have been in the forefront of efforts to establish the agenda. And here I can point actually to the role of my friend and colleague, Sanam Narahin Anderlini, who is the founder of ICANN, an organization on the board of which I have the honor to sit. ICANN is the International Civil Society Action Network, and it's an NGO based in Washington, but basically working with women's organizations across the globe, helping women basically bring a gender lens to conflict and supporting their own local activism in the WPS realm. So Sanam's role in bringing about the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is well known, so I won't actually elaborate on it. She's been one of the architects of this resolution, not the only one, but one of the architects. And that speaks to the fact that women in the region, having borne the brunt of conflicts in the 1970s, 1980s, were more attuned to the issue of peace and security in many ways than, unfortunately, their male counterparts who were still trying to settle their scores with violence. I will say that for my part, I have a very modest contribution, which is of more recent vintage, with my own research center at the Université de Montréal, where with support from Global Affairs Canada, we were able a couple of years ago to support 25 activists from Western Africa, mostly the Sahel region and the Ivory Coast, and actually, first of all, acquiring the vocabulary that allows them to speak to international fora, something that I know we'll be discussing later, because women don't necessarily need training on WPS issues. They are leaders in these issues. What they do need sometimes is a way of translating what it is that they actually do in the field to people who use a different language and different vocabulary and don't therefore necessarily see what they do as important in the peace and security realm. So with my network, we helped 25 women both acquire those skills, but also more importantly, again, something that I'll speak to later on, network with one another. Because in many ways, I think activism in the field, as I see it, comes in two shapes and forms. The first is allowing women to connect with one another, to be able to amplify their efforts, to become more visible, to learn from one another. And the other, and that's the educator in me, empowering young women to actually enter the field, particularly its more male-dominated areas, which is, hard security issues, ceasefire negotiations, security sector reform, dealing with armed actors, basically helping some of my younger students become the activists of tomorrow. So that's how I see my own activism in the field, but I do not have the same long history in the field as some of my colleagues. So I'd rather leave them to the space to be able to talk about what it is they have done.
Thank you for that, Professor Zahar. Dr. Yasmin?
Thank you so much, reflecting on our journey and recognizing the pivotal role played by many women, particularly women of color, in establishing the Women, Peace and Security agenda is always a heartwarming experience. And I actually felt that in the tone of Professor Zahar when she was sharing. We are familiar with the historical milestones that brought us here, starting with the Commission on the Status of Women in 1969, a year when I was only 4 years old, which resolved to afford special protection to women and children. Many of us also recall the General Assembly's Declaration on the Protection of Women and Children in Emergency and Armed Conflict in 1974. However, it was the UN World Conference on Women in Mexico in 1975 that highlighted the vital connection between gender equality and peace, a message that resonated in Nairobi in 1985. The Beijing Declaration of 1995 brought us closer to the WPS agenda by addressing the impact of war on women and girls and their role in conflict resolution and peace building. At this time, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders had not yet come into existence, but its current international advisors, Cora Wise, Betty Reardon, not women of color, but with hearts dedicated to the excluded and marginalized, and Ambassador Chowdhury contributed to the establishment. In May 1999, in The Hague, 10,000 people from over 100 countries gathered for a peace conference under the banner of Peace is a Human Right and Time to Abolish War. Civil society leaders who attended this conference, including Cora and Betty, and Sanam, as mentioned by Professor Sahar, among others, collaborated with UNIFEM, which in turn approached the UN Security Council to adopt a resolution on women and peace. It's a beautiful story of civil society's triumph and the triumph of women, many of them women of color, asserting their right to protection during times of war and crisis, and their right to meaningfully participate in decisions that promote peace and collective security, given their unique experiences and perspectives, attributes, and skills. The Global Network of Women Peace Builders, 21 years since the establishment of the WPS agenda, has been tirelessly working to translate this global policy into action where it is needed the most. The creation of the agenda was one thing, but rolling it out is another. For over 2 decades, we have been collaborating with women of color from Afghanistan to Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo to Papua New Guinea, and beyond to support the development, implementation, and monitoring of WPS resolutions. We firmly believe that real change occurs when women's voices are not only heard, but also considered by local community leaders. GNWP's localization of Women, Peace, and Security strategy is currently implemented in over 20 countries and has yielded tangible results. These include the inclusion of women in traditional conflict resolution councils, improved responses to sexual and gender-based violence, and the formulation of practical actions that enhance the lives of local communities. I'll give a little example, a little story where I was part of it. In the Matagoan Budong Council in the Philippines, in Northern Philippines, that has been actually led by women, for centuries. We asked the question when we were doing localization, where are the women? And, the men were very much surprised by that question. And, they asked themselves, each other, where are the women? So we asked them, are there any rules, that tell you that women should be excluded in this decision-making mechanism in your community? And they asked again each other, is there any rule? And then they said, Madam, it's a tradition. It's a tradition that we have been following, through the years. And so this is the reason why we don't have women. And, after 2 years, when we came back, or even less, they reported that they already included 6 women in the decision council mechanism. Certainly, our localization help and other factors, but it is really wonderful to know that, it can change. Traditions can change if we challenge it. Thank you.
Traditions change if we challenge it. I love that. Ms. Hurtado, if I can invite you to offer comments.
Bueno, escuchando aquí a las compañeras, también nosotras las mujeres negras hemos venido trabajando la resolución 1325, en especial sus pilares y el más importante para nosotras, la participación, ya que con la participación hemos logrado el liderazgo de las mujeres, que es esencial para lograr la paz. También trabajamos ese empoderamiento económico para que las mujeres tengan sus recursos para no depender de su compañero, que es algo muy fundamental, ya que acá en nuestros territorios las mujeres viven muchas violencias basadas en género y muchas de ellas siguen con sus compañeros porque no tienen cómo alimentar a sus hijos. Por eso trabajamos demasiado el empoderamiento económico con ellas y la construcción de paz desde el hogar, desde nuestro territorio es muy importante para nuestras comunidades. Las mujeres negras han desempeñado un papel importante que es promover la igualdad de género y abordar todas esas violencias en el contexto del conflicto, contribuyendo a una construcción de entornos más pacíficos y seguros para todas las mujeres, las niñas y las adolescentes. Trabajamos la formación y la capacitación. Desde acá trabajamos mucho, como les decía, la participación política, y eso ha logrado que nuestras mujeres ya participen para ser alcaldesas de sus comunidades, para ser presidentas de juntas de acción comunal, para ser gobernadora, para llegar al uno de los cargos más grandes de toma de decisiones, que es como lo tenemos ahora, la vicepresidencia de la República, que está en manos de una mujer negra, lideresa y defensora de derechos humanos. También se trabaja mucho la implementación y el seguimiento de la resolución 1325. Acá en mi localidad son 42 municipalidades, de las cuales ya en 10 hemos logrado colocar, implementar la resolución 1325 y hacerle un seguimiento para supervisar y evaluar esta implementación, estas políticas relacionadas con la Agenda Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad, porque es muy importante que nuestros mandatarios se apropien de esta resolución, así como nosotras las mujeres nos hemos apropiado, y es la bandera que llevamos a los territorios, porque si no hay una paz estable y duradera para las mujeres, no puede haber una paz en Colombia.
Well said, yes. Madame Annie, voici ma question. Plusieurs d'entre nous ont entendu les histoires des contributions des femmes racialisées. Dans les années 1980 et 90, dans leur plaidoyer incluant, ce qui amène à la création de l'agenda FPS. Nous savons que vous êtes activé dans ce domaine depuis longtemps. Pouvez-vous nous dire plus à propos de vos contributions ou des contributions de vos réseaux à l'établissement de l'agenda FPS? Annie?
Oui, je crois que l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité, qui est un programme international et qui vise à promouvoir la participation des femmes dans le processus de paix et de sécurité. Il y a eu de nombreuses contributions importantes des femmes dans les années 1990 qui ont amené à l'adoption de cet agenda le 31 octobre 2000. Les leaders des organisations féminines ont plaidé avant l'adoption de cet agenda par le Conseil de sécurité afin de mettre fin au conflit dans nos différents pays et surtout en RDC. C'est le cas des femmes congolaises qui avaient organisé une marche de plaidoyer à New York au mois de mars 2000 sous le mandat du secrétaire général Kofi Annan pour réclamer qu'il y ait la fin des conflits en RDC. Et moi, en tant que membre, je suis présidente honoraire de la Ligue internationale de femmes pour la paix et la liberté, WILF en sigle. Nous avons centré toutes nos actions sur la mise en œuvre de cet agenda. Et il est important de souligner que l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité, dans le contexte de la RDC, reste toujours un sujet d'actualité. Les femmes sont impliquées dans l'élaboration de cet agenda historique. Personnellement, je suis formatrice dans cet agenda, même dans l'agenda Jeunesse, Paix et Sécurité, où j'ai eu à former, je crois, toutes les couches de la population, en commençant par les acteurs clés des différentes composantes, que ce soit l'armée, la police, la société civile, les personnes vivant avec handicap, et tout ça. Et j'ai même écrit un glossaire des termes de la résolution 1325 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies et ces résolutions connexes de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité. Et je suis réellement impliquée sur les contributions à l'établissement de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité. Et nous avons, avec l'aide de GNWP, en train de faire la localisation au niveau local pour qu'on puisse avoir les plans de développement local sur l'étendue de la RDC qui compose au moins 26 provinces. Il y a au moins 5 provinces qui sont en train de mener les activités de la localisation de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité. Voilà quelques contributions.
Merci, Annie. You know, in all of the different contexts that many of you have highlighted, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the growing and more visible anti-feminist and anti-gender movements. Now, many women peace builders are seeing a shrinking of the space they're able to work in. In this context, what do you see as the key barriers inhibiting women of color's contributions to peace and the advancement of the WPS agenda? What is their role in connecting grassroots advocacy to multilateral fora? And in that sense, what are your recommendations for addressing such challenges? Professor Zahar?
So,
Je crois que le défi majeur dans cet agenda, l'agenda d'abord est mal connu. Nous devrons continuer la vulgarisation de cet agenda parce qu'elle est vraiment mal connue. 23 ans après, l'agenda n'est pas encore arrivé à un point où les personnes peuvent l'intérioriser. Et ensuite, il y a un problème de manque de volonté politique. Parce que, comme vous le savez, le Conseil des Nations Unies demande aux États de pouvoir mettre la mise en œuvre de cet agenda. Mais comme il y a un problème de financement, ce qui fait que la mise en œuvre n'est pas réelle dans le cas de la RDC. Nous menons des plaidoyers pour que cet agenda puisse être dans le budget national. Si l'agenda se trouve dans le budget national, à ce moment-là, ça peut aider pour qu'il y ait une mise en œuvre efficace et efficiente. Donc, voilà quelques défis que nous avons pour la mise en œuvre de cet agenda au niveau de la RDC.
Merci, Madame Annie. Professor Zahar, can I ask you to offer your comments?
Je vais emboîter le pas à Annie pour dire qu'elle a tout à fait raison que l'un des problèmes continue d'être en fait les gouvernements qui ne sont pas tout à fait convaincus et qui ne sont pas de véritables partenaires dans la mise en œuvre de l'agenda. Having said that, I actually want to speak about other problems that tend to be associated, in my opinion, much more with the current anti-gender backlash. The first has to do with the security of the women activists. Something that we were reminded of, I think, very painfully when our Afghan colleagues were left behind and ended up at the bottom of the lists of people to be cared for and evacuated when the Taliban came back to power. Women take risks. They are courageous, but they need to be backed. And particularly where there is anti-gender backlash, there is a duty and a responsibility upon their partners whether academic centers or foreign governments. In the West and more broadly, more generally in international fora, to actually think about their security and take concrete measures to provide for this security. I would also say that there are two other types of barriers, which are more structural and not necessarily unique to the current environment, but maybe exacerbated by the current environment. The presence of gatekeepers. Not all women are advocates for women, and some women have used the WPS agenda for personal advancement, blocking particularly younger generations from emerging. And that, I think, is something that we need to be very mindful of as we, as activists, as scholars, engage with other colleagues and collaboration. We need to really think about how to bring along those young generations that tend to be excluded because it's often the usual suspects that get invited. And we're part of that problem. We are usual suspects, let's put it this way. But we need to do better, okay? And I think that there's a problem of genuine partnerships, a problem of genuine partnerships in which women of color, particularly women of color working at the local level, are not simply seen as implementers or junior partners, but as full partners in whatever endeavors we create. And that brings me to the issue of connecting advocacy to multilateral fora. I honestly am not sure it is the responsibility of women of color to think about that. That is where it is our responsibility. Given the context in which most of them work, demanding of them to do the work without the support, without resources, and on top of that, to actually think about how to connect their advocacy to multilateral fora is demanding the impossible. That is where I think that my first recommendation is to think of ourselves as intermediaries. It is for people like us who are in positions of relative visibility and power to make space for women of color, to bring them along to meetings, not to speak for them, not to speak about them, but to provide them with the platforms from which to speak. I'm an academic, and in the academic world, fighting for women's inclusion has meant basically a commitment by some people not to attend what we call manels, which is panels composed mostly of men, right? We should insist on a similar principle. Representation of women of color in WPS discussions, in international fora, should be based on the principle nothing about them without them. And we should be willing not to attend, including important discussions, if that is not acted upon. That, I think, in a nutshell, is where I stand on this issue.
I thank you so much, Professor Zohar. If that isn't a call to stand up and be brave, I don't know what is. Can I ask Dr. Hasmeen? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Siham. Since I began working on this agenda in 2007, one of the most significant barriers I observed hindering the contributions of women of color to peace and the WPS agenda is discrimination and marginalization. Some of the disturbing comments I have heard from men were, "You get your monthly periods, hence you become irrational and erratic during these periods. How can you become effective leaders?" Or, "Your voices are very seductive. You will distract the men from thinking straight." Women in my country often face very formidable challenges, especially Muslim and indigenous women. However, within women's communities, other forms of intersectional discrimination persist. Women who were not associated with well-known or large women's organizations, but were actively engaged in WPS work, faced skepticism. Similarly, women who were not originally from conflict-affected communities, but were actively supporting conflict resolution efforts within those communities, were often perceived as outsiders. This kind of intersectional discrimination compounds the challenges women of color already face in male-dominated peace and security spaces. Sadly, women of color can sometimes exhibit the same biases towards each other when women do not belong to their established groups. I refer to this as the barrier of women coloring other women, and it is counterproductive to advancing the interconnected agenda. Since 2007, I've also observed that women of color have limited access to financial and logistical resources, which hampers their ability to participate in national or international peace-related events, as already mentioned by Professor Zahar. So what can we do to address these challenges? Firstly, we can bridge the gap between grassroots advocacy and international platforms. GNWP serves, for example, as a powerful voice for marginalized communities, ensuring that the concerns and needs of those most affected by conflict are heard at the international level. The experiences and insights of our partner organizations actively inform policy discussions and decisions in multilateral forums. During my tenure as the coordinator of Women Engaging Action on Resolution 1325 in the Philippines, we invested in programs that empower our women of color, mainly again, the indigenous women and Moro women. We provided them with the skills and knowledge needed to participate in political processes and engaged effectively in peace and security initiatives. This included training in negotiation, leadership, and conflict resolution. As a result of our training programs, grassroots women dared to enter the political arena. Some emerged victorious, while others did not. But the sheer courage they displayed by taking on political giants was an incredible accomplishment. They were shattering thick glass ceilings. We must also ensure that peace and security initiatives adopt an intersectional approach. The conflicts, gender injustices, and humanitarian crises we confront are substantial enough. There is no room for compartmentalized agendas. Our focus should be on the quadruple nexus of women, development, peace, and security. Let us work collaboratively along the intersections instead of getting bogged down in territorial disputes. We cannot work towards social cohesion while modeling divisiveness ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking us to look inward. Ms. Hurtado?
Bueno, nosotras las mujeres negras, sin duda, hemos sido las más marginalizadas en los conflictos, al igual que otras mujeres de diferentes grupos étnicos y culturales. Nosotras enfrentamos muchísimos obstáculos que nos impiden nuestra contribución a la paz y a la resolución de conflictos, ¿sí? También los recursos económicos nos limitan para aportar más de lo que nosotras podemos dar. Hay diferentes factores que nos permiten esos obstáculos, como la discriminación y el racismo sistemático, porque las mujeres negras en el mundo enfrentamos discriminación racial que puede limitar el acceso a recursos, a oportunidades, a la participación en los procesos de paz. También la marginalización social y económica. Eso dificulta la capacidad para nosotras influir en la toma de decisiones y participar en las iniciativas de paz. La violencia de género. Las mujeres negras pueden ser víctimas o somos víctimas de violencias basadas en género solamente por nuestro color. Y eso afecta nuestra seguridad, nuestro bienestar y desalienta nuestra participación en la construcción de paz. También falta representación de mujeres negras en los espacios de toma de decisiones, tanto gubernamental como organizaciones de paz. Eso limita la voz y la perspectiva en la toma de decisiones de las mujeres negras. La desigualdad económica, que es una brecha que siempre ha estado ahí en la línea para nosotras las mujeres negras, para poder participar, para estar en programas de desarrollo, en programas de emprendimiento, de empoderamiento, y a la vez esto nos impide dar más aportes a la construcción de paz de las que nosotras quisiéramos dar. También tenemos los estereotipos de género. Eso también son prejuicios para nosotras poder influir y en la sociedad y nos dificulta la participación efectiva en la construcción de paz. Nosotras las mujeres negras promovemos la paz, la inclusión de todas las etnias. Hacemos nuestro mayor esfuerzo para lograr una paz fundamental para abordar todos los obstáculos a través de políticas, programas, proyectos y fomentamos siempre la igualdad, la justicia y la diversidad. Pedimos también el respeto por ser un mundo multiétnico y pluricultural donde convergemos diferentes razas. Para nosotras las mujeres negras, poder conectar con los foros multilaterales, lo primero que pedimos es conectar la defensa popular de nosotras las negras. Esto implica establecer un punto efectivo entre las voces, las preocupaciones de la sociedad civil y los procesos en la toma de decisiones a nivel internacional. Esto nosotras desde las mujeres negras creemos que lo podemos lograr a través de la movilización ciudadana, que esto fomenta la participación activa de la sociedad civil en temas de interés para nosotras las mujeres negras, creando conciencia y generando apoyo a través de campañas, protestas pacíficas y difusión de la información. También tenemos redes de conciliación, que son colaboración de organizaciones no gubernamentales y otros actores de la sociedad civil para amplificar la influencia y la capacidad de incidencia de los foros multilaterales. Participación en procesos de consulta. Esto es involucrarse en consultas de diálogos organizados por organismos multilaterales para que las voces de la sociedad civil sean tenidas en cuenta en la toma de decisiones. También hacemos un lobby y una presión diplomática para trabajar en coordinación con los gobiernos y delegaciones nacionales e internacionales en los foros multilaterales para promover agendas de las mujeres negras alineadas en la defensa popular. La educación creemos que es muy importante para generar conciencia y capacitar a la sociedad civil sobre la importancia de los foros multilaterales, cómo pueden influir sobre ellos. Al conectar la defensa popular, los foros multilaterales promueven la democracia participativa y se asegura que las preocupaciones de la ciudadanía sean tenidas en cuenta en la toma de decisiones a nivel internacional. ¿Qué recomendaciones como mujeres negras enfrentamos nosotros y qué retos podemos dar? ¿Qué retos podemos tener? Creemos que la educación y la concienciación, fomentar la educación en nuestras instituciones educativas, creemos que de allí vienen los principios y los objetivos del feminismo para desmitificar conceptos erróneos y prejuicios sobre el racismo. Diálogo constructivo, que es promover el diálogo respetuoso y constructivos con aquellos que sostienen opiniones diferentes, antifeministas, para fomentar la comprensión mutua y la posibilidad de cambio de actitudes. Alianzas y colaboración. Trabajar en alianza con otros grupos y movimientos que abogan por la igualdad de género para fortalecer la voz y el impacto del feminismo. Defensa de nuestros derechos como mujeres. Continuar defendiendo nuestros derechos, ya los que hemos tenido y los que podemos lograr, defendiendo la igualdad de género a nivel político, legal y social. Creemos también que los medios de comunicación deben tener desafíos de representación y no hacer un feminismo sesgado en los medios de comunicación para no promover narrativas que no sean favorables a las mujeres. La movilización. Nos organizamos y nos movilizamos para contrarrestar las acciones y las políticas antifeministas que amenazan los avances hacia la igualdad de género. Y también el empoderamiento de las mujeres creemos que es importante para fortalecer la participación y el liderazgo de las mujeres en todos los ámbitos de la sociedad. Abordar todos los movimientos antifeministas requiere un enfoque equilibrado que conviene la promoción de la igualdad de género con el diálogo, la educación, para superar la resistencia y los principios feministas que lo único que buscan es la igualdad de género.
Well said. Thank you, Zulma. Madame Annie, voici ma question. Plusieurs personnes qui travaillent sur des enjeux liés à l'agenda FPS, étant très jeunes et ou n'étant pas encore vivants. Lorsque de femmes racialisées locales plaidant pour l'établissement de l'agenda, comment pouvons-ils puiser dans la mémoire collective du mouvement et s'assurer que les contributions ne se perdent pas dans l'histoire. Annie?
Oui, il est vrai que de nombreuses personnes qui travaillent sur les enjeux liés à l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité étaient encore très jeunes au moment où cette résolution a été adoptée ou n'étaient pas encore nées. Lorsque les femmes racialisées locales plaidaient à l'établissement de cet agenda qui est très important pour nous. Mais cependant, il est important de se rappeler que les contributions des femmes racialisées ont été essentielles pour la création de cet agenda, comme je l'avais dit avant. Nous avons joué un rôle dans la prévention et la résolution des consolidations, ainsi que dans les transitions collectives. Pour préserver la mémoire collective, il est important de sensibiliser les gens aux contributions des femmes qui ont travaillé pour éliminer les obstacles auxquels nous sommes confrontés, parce qu'il y a plusieurs femmes qui travaillent pour essayer de réduire tout ce qui est stéréotype. Depuis qu'on est né, par exemple, moi, depuis que je suis née, on me parle que vous êtes femme, vous êtes bien pour vous marier, pour vous faire des enfants, être à la cuisine. Mais il y a des femmes maintenant qui travaillent pour essayer de réduire tous ces stéréotypes qui sont nés avec nous, mais que nous devrons réellement briser. Et dans ces cas, moi, je recommanderais peut-être qu'il y ait des musées et des mémoriaux qui peuvent également être très indicatifs pour jouer ce rôle de la prévention de la mémoire collective. Et il est important aussi de soutenir le travail que les femmes racialisées font pour faire avancer cet agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité. Merci.
Thank you, Annie. For our panelists, taking an intergenerational perspective on the conversation, many people who are working on issues related to the WPS agenda were very young or not even alive when grassroots women of color were advocating for the establishment of the agenda. How can they tap into the collective memory of this movement and ensure that the contributions don't get lost in history? I don't know if we've lost Professor Zahar. If I can ask Dr. Hasmin for your commentary on that while we're waiting for Professor Zahar.
Sure, Siham. You know, a colleague once asked me, why do you have so many young staff at GNWP? You know, we have many young team members because we recognize the importance of mentorship to facilitate the transfer of knowledge and skills. The WPS agenda was created so that advocates, young and seasoned, can work together and not in silos. Mutual femtoring can happen when the two are in a shared workspace. There are also a lot of things that we can learn, you know, from the young. Or at the very least, you know, facilitate conversations between the seasoned advocates and the younger generations. These dialogues can be structured to encourage the exchange of knowledge, experiences, and wisdom. To ensure that the contributions do not get lost in history, you know, we can document the stories and experiences of women who were at the forefront of the WPS movement in its early days, conduct oral history interviews with these activists and leaders to capture their insights and firsthand accounts. We should also write about and teach these stories. You know, at the Women's College, where I taught for 35 years, we integrated the Women, Peace, and Security agenda into our peace education textbook and in the teaching and learning process. This ensures that younger generations are exposed to this important history. In Aceh 2 weeks ago, where GNWP held a Women, Peace, and Security training, we screened the movie Pray the Devil Back to Hell. In Jiwaka, Papua New Guinea, we showed a documentary of 3 women who braved armed violence in their communities to prevent war from escalating. Participants gave a rousing applause after watching these films. Stories of and by women of color can be very powerful tools for raising awareness. Well, there are so many more to share, but I only have, a couple of minutes. My parting message is that we work together to ensure that the invaluable contributions of grassroots women of color are remembered and continue to inspire and guide future generations in their pursuit of gender equality, peace, and security. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hesween. And I've certainly benefited from my feminist elders and being able to participate and continue to create spaces. Ms. Hurtado?
Bueno, entonces nosotros, ¿cómo hacemos para que esa memoria no se pierda? Nosotras creemos que una de las cosas que se debe hacer es asegurar esa memoria de las mujeres negras en todas las contribuciones que ellas han hecho a lo largo de la historia y para que no se pierdan. Para que no se pierdan, creo que es importante registrar y documentar la historia, los logros, las experiencias de mujeres negras en sus diversas formas, incluyendo estos libros, material bibliográfico, entrevistas, archivos y la educación inclusiva, hacer paneles de estudio a la historia de las mujeres negras para que nuestras jóvenes sepan que las mujeres negras también han aportado a la construcción de paz. Tener plataformas para visibilizar y promover los espacios donde las mujeres negras puedan compartir sus perspectivas y contribuciones que han hecho a la paz. Eventos culturales, medios de comunicación que se fomenten en difundir todos los logros de las mujeres negras, todo su activismo, mujeres políticas, mujeres en la ciencia, en el arte, en la cultura, para que todas nuestras futuras generaciones puedan saber cuál es el papel que ha jugado la mujer negra en la historia y en la construcción de paz. Hacer reconocimientos a mujeres negras, ya que hay muy pocos reconocimientos para las mujeres negras, para que se destaquen en las contribuciones y sobresalgan en todas las disciplinas en las que ellas han estado. Porque yo creo que al respetar y celebrar la memoria colectiva de las mujeres negras, se contribuye a una sociedad más inclusiva y se asegura que su valiosa contribución a la paz sea reconocida y perdure en la historia.
Muchas gracias. Professor Zahar, we're happy to have you back with us.
Sorry, this was bound to happen. I haven't had the opportunity to hear all that my colleagues have said, but from what I heard from Ms. Hurtado, I totally agree that documentation is key. In a context of particularly anti-gender backlash, during which we might see the agenda wane, it is important to document what has been achieved, to analyze what has worked, what has not, why, and to draw lessons from the past to inform the future. When I look at new generations, however, I cannot but be heartened because even though they see the backlash, they're not paralyzed. So I think, while documentation is important, it's also important to allow them to forge their own path. And in terms of an intergenerational look, what that means is for us, more seasoned, I guess, activists and academics in this realm, to support them, to be there for them, to continue to educate them on the issues, and ultimately, to make space for them, because our battles may not be their battles. The context may change, and we need to be there to provide advice if they want it, but also we need to be able, to know when to step back and let them take over and let them actually lead the way. So I will stop with that. I see that there's very little time, and I assume that there might be questions from our audience. So let me take the opportunity actually to thank you again for inviting me to this discussion. This is quite heartening in the current context.
No, thank you, Professor Zahar. And I think hearing from all of you and listening to all of you has been a real gift for so many of us that are either emerging and coming up and growing up in an era where we see women activists bringing all of their wisdom to the foreground. And so we do have questions, and I want to pose this question to our whole panel. And unfortunately, this is the only question we can pose because we want to leave room for closing remarks from Dr. Rima. So one of the questions that we have is, what does decolonizing peace and security look like in your daily work? What does rest and recuperation mean for you as a racialized woman or global South peace builder? What has been your greatest joy in working in this space? So if I can ask Professor Zahar to kick us off.
A set of difficult questions in many ways. What does decolonizing the WPS agenda mean? It means actually foregrounding the work that's being done at the local level in the global South by women of color in Western countries as well, by marginalized women, by excluded communities. It means, as an academic, making sure that these voices are in my syllabi, that they're not an afterthought. My greatest joy is actually seeing young students who are inspired by this and who launch into a life of activism in this field. I think we absolutely need to make sure there is a new generation to take over. And I'm heartened to see them, so courageous in a difficult context in which, unlike 2000s, the world is full of dark skies. As for rest and recuperation, what does it mean for me? I guess it means not having to justify why I'm entitled to have a voice and to talk about what we, I'm kind of sort of a hybrid, but we women who grew up in the South and who ended up in the West, why we are to have a voice. And that's where I'll end, because I think a panel like this one is rest and recuperation for me. It allows me to feel like I don't have to fight. I don't have to justify why I'm entitled to talk about experiences, no matter how small they are, and to think with others loudly about how to push the agenda forward. And so for that, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the organizers.
Thank you. Spaces for Joy. Dr. Hasmeen?
Thank you so much, Siham. Those are difficult questions, but I think that what we're doing right now is actually a process of decolonizing peace already, because we're challenging, structures and traditions, that have been rooted in colonialism. So I think the work that I heard, throughout this 1.5 hours is already a process of decolonizing peace. And it's also, of course, means, emphasizing the need to redefine peace and security frameworks, because they used to be, just being the absence of war, when there are other emerging, humanitarian crises and other forms of violence that we experience. So also, it also means for me, actually, seeking to address, the inequalities and power imbalances that we experience, at this time. And I think that what I heard from Professor Zahar and from Zuma and from Annie, actually talk about, this process of decolonization. What are my greatest joys in doing this mission, Siham? There are actually plenty, but I was just in a discussion last night, with a colleague, and I was sharing with her, the choice of seeing, for example, young men, saying that we're supporting this agenda, especially if they're coming from very traditional cultures. And I'll give an example, a specific example in Aceh. the young men that I spoke to last week, were very enthusiastic in saying that, this is something unheard of, in our culture, in our practice, but we are open to it. And I could really feel the sincerity, in their shared expression. And this is like one of the things, that make me very, very joyous, and it's something that makes me really say that I'm so happy I'm in this kind of work. Also, I'm very happy, when women come to me and tell me that, after, like this training or this sharing, or after our conversation, I realized that I was not just like made, for the home, that I have a voice, that I can speak out and I can participate. It's not only once, Siham, that, a woman like that, came to me and expressed to me the gratitude, for bringing in, that inspiration, to do something beyond being a homemaker. So hearing people, saying that their mindsets have been transformed, their attitudes actually have been shaped by a simple training, warms my heart. And this is something that I will do over and over again, because I believe, that in the power of teaching, the power of education, that education can liberate, education can transform mindsets and attitudes and behavior that can change the world. So thank you, Sia.
Thank you. Zulma?
Hola, aquí estoy. Pues yo alegrías con la resolución he tenido muchas en este trabajo. Una es llegar a los territorios de las mujeres más vulnerables que han sido víctimas del conflicto armado y poderles decir, vamos a trabajar juntas con esta resolución, poder llegar a esa alcaldía y decirle al alcalde, vea, usted debe implementar la resolución 1325 en su plan de gobierno, usted debe proteger a las mujeres de su territorio, y que el alcalde te diga, sí, todo lo que ustedes me han dicho de la resolución va porque va en el plan de desarrollo para estas comunidades. Entonces esas son alegrías que después de uno haber hecho tanto año un trabajo, va viendo que ya va dando frutos, cuando ya los alcaldes se van apropiando de la agenda paz, mujeres y seguridad. Personas que hemos visto que han sido como tan reacias y ya como que van aceptando que uno llegue a los espacios y le hable de la resolución 1325. Esas son alegrías que a uno lo llenan. Ver mujeres jóvenes que le digan a uno, yo quiero que usted me enseñe sobre la resolución 1325, yo quiero aprender para ir a replicar a mi comunidad. Son alegrías que lo llenan. Y yo tengo 3 hijas. Y mis hijas me dicen, mamá, yo quiero ser como usted, hablar duro sobre la resolución 1325 y sobre la paz para las mujeres. Esa es una de mis más grandes alegrías.
Muchas gracias. Madame Annie? Oui. Voici ma question. Quelle a été votre plus grande joie en travaillant dans cet espace, et à quoi ressemble la de décolonisation, de la paix et de la sécurité dans votre travail? Not sure if Madame Annie can hear us.
Oui, ma grande joie de travailler dans cet agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité est de pouvoir amener les acteurs clés à connaître cet agenda et de pouvoir amener les jeunes, parce qu'on a parlé de la génération, intergénération. Et si on dit bien que si tous les acteurs pouvaient connaître l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité, je crois qu'on changera le monde. Et je suis vraiment d'accord avec ça, parce qu'on aura la paix. et partout il y aura le développement. Mais aussi longtemps que cet agenda n'est pas connu, n'est pas appliqué, n'est pas mis en œuvre, on aura des difficultés, surtout dans les pays comme les miens, la RDC, de pouvoir se développer pour que la femme puisse trouver la paix, la quiétude, et que les femmes soient moins violées, que les femmes puissent vaquer dans leurs activités journalières sans être inquiétées, que les femmes puissent participer aux tables de négociation, à la prise de décisions, qu'elles soient protégées, qu'on puisse prévenir et surtout qu'elles soient autonomisées. Parce que quand la femme a une autonomisation, elle est indépendante et puis elle peut avancer dans sa propre vie pour avoir un épanouissement. Mais aussi longtemps que cet agenda ne sera pas réellement mis en œuvre, je crois que nous allons continuer à tourner en rond et ça ne servira à rien de continuer à prendre des résolutions connexes sur l'agenda femmes, paix et sécurité si on n'arrive pas à mettre en œuvre les résolutions précédentes. Voilà ma conclusion.
Merci, Annie. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to our panelists, and I'd like to close our session today and invite Dr. Rima Salah to offer the closing remarks. Dr. Rima Salah is Treasurer of the Board of Directors of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. She is a former UNICEF Deputy Executive Director and former Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General, United Nations Mission in the Central African Republic and Chad. Dr. Rima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Ambassador O'Neill, distinguished participants, it gives me great honor to be with you this morning, this afternoon, and to thank you all for joining us today for this very important conversation. All gratitude for the panelists and moderators for sharing with us your experiences, and to the global network of women peace builders and women of color advancing peace, security, and conflict transformation for convening a space for this discussion. It is a pleasure to celebrate with you the 23rd anniversary of the adoption of the resolution 1325, as you are the pioneers in the cause for peace. Comme vous l'avez entendu de nos panélistes formidables, les femmes racialisées sont les porteuses de l'agenda femmes, paix et sécurité depuis longtemps, bien avant l'adoption de la résolution 1325, il y a environ 20 ans. Leur leadership et leur plaidoyer ont convaincu les décideurs de l'instance internationale de sécurité de plus haut niveau que les questions de genre ne sont pas seulement pertinentes, mais bien critiques pour atteindre la paix et la sécurité mondiale. Since then, women of color have contributed to build and sustain the agenda. Women peace builders in the Middle East, in Colombia and the Philippines have worked to build some of the most gender-inclusive peace agreements. Also, although we didn't have representations from Afghanistan, we know that women leaders in Afghanistan and in Iran fight tirelessly, lobbying down systems of gender apartheid. Women civil society in Congo provide the saving gender response, humanitarian action for international displacement, for internally displaced people. I also witnessed Women's Action for Peace when I was UNICEF Regional Director in West and Central Africa in the early 2000s. They literally invaded a meeting of West African presidents in Monrovia, Liberia, saying, "You are our fathers, our brothers. We ask you to stop the war now. We ask you to stop the war and the devastation and violence and this humanitarian crisis in West Africa. Unfortunately, we are living in a critical global context marked by unprecedented threats to peace and security. As you all know, 2 weeks ago, war raged in my home, Palestine and Israel, claiming the lives of hundreds of men, women, and children, causing also the displacement of more than 1 million people, posing threats to protection of children and the fulfillment of their needs, violating humanitarian and human rights. GNWP held a Zoom meeting with the leadership of Palestinian and Israeli women peace builders who want our help, our solidarity to raise their voices of peace, their voices of justice, to reach the media, the United Nations, policymakers and religious leaders. Ceci est seulement le début de cette conversation. Nous continuerons nos discussions avec elles. Nous continuerons de reconnaître le travail des femmes racialisées pour la cause de la paix. Nous continuerons surtout ces conversations avec la génération émergente de jeunes femmes qui sont les leaders et aussi en maintenant la responsabilité de mener vers l'avant le travail de ce mouvement. We listen to your problems. We listen to the obstacles along the way. We will work with you. We will work with you to resolve those obstacles and really to reach our objective. But what we need is an unfailing vision, an unwavering commitment to change the tides of violence for a more peaceful world. We can do it with you. We can do it by combating exclusion, by combating racial women of color who are very marginalized. We will work with you. And I think, and I always say it, the time is now and we have to do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rima. It feels as though this entire conversation we've had today has felt like a call to action, as well as a passing of the baton from one generation to the next, and I hope onwards to the next. I want to thank the panelists for your unwavering courage and support, and thank you to everybody that's been with us. Thank you.